Yes, my dears, I'm back with the continuation of my story. My husband returned after 39 years. So many things happened after he came to the door. The real story is just beginning now. "Hello, Sarah," he said in a voice I recognized immediately. "Even after all these years, I'm Albert. I'm back for you." My dears, there are no words to describe what I felt at that moment. It was as if I had seen a ghost. As if the past had come back to claim me after almost half a century. I could neither speak nor move. I was trying to understand what my eyes were seeing. Albert was standing at my door, but this was not the Albert I knew, not the young man of 26 who took his suitcase and left with so many promises. Here was a 67-year-old man. His hair was completely gray. His skin was wrinkled from the sun, thinner than before, but it was definitely him. The same brown eyes. The habit of tilting his head slightly to the side when he spoke. Those big, hard-working hands. "Can I come in?" he finally asked after what seemed like an eternity of silence. "We need to talk, Sarah." It sounded more tired, but it was the same voice. It sounded very similar to the voice that had said, "I love you" to me so many times when we were young, or so I wanted it to sound. I still couldn't react. My mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. You were dead," I finally said, as if talking to a spirit. "You were officially declared dead. Almost 38 years ago. What are you doing here?" Albert bowed his head and said slowly, "You're right. You have a lot of questions, darling," he said. "I have a lot to explain too. Can we sit down and talk? I've come a long way to see you." I don't know why I let him in. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe because I really needed some answers after all these years. Maybe there was a part of me that still wanted to see him again. I showed him the living room, offered him coffee, more out of habit, not out of courtesy. My hands were shaking as I prepared the coffee. 1,001 thoughts in my mind. What was that all about? When I came back into the living room, Albert was looking at the photographs on the shelf. Photos of my son Daryl, who graduated as an engineer, photos of my grandchildren, photos of my marriage to Harvey, photos of our travels. "You had a good life," he said with a sad smile. "I'm really happy to know that." At that moment, surprise gave way to anger. "Albert, you left me 39 years ago. You left me alone with my 1-year-old son. I had to rebuild my life from scratch. And now you tell me you're happy that I'm happy, as if nothing happened." Albert shook his head with a serious expression. "Sarah, you have every right to be angry with me. You have every right to hate me. But please, let me tell you what happened. Let me explain why I can't go back. Please." And then, he began to tell a story I could never have guessed, the explanation behind 39 years of silence. But it's also a story that brings new questions and an even deeper pain. Reminiscing, when I came to Jacksonville in late 1983, Albert said, "Everything was so different than I expected. It was a story of shame and failure. It makes sense, doesn't it? The story of a young man crushed by the burdens of life." But as Albert spoke, 1,000 questions swirled in Sarah's mind. Was this really it? Or was this just the tip of the iceberg? Let's find the answers to these questions together with Sarah. "The work at the factory was very hard," he said, "and they paid very little. We slept on bunk beds. We shared a dirty bathroom and lived on canned soup and beans. But I held on because I thought about you and our son." After a few months, she met some men. They told him he could make more money in another state. "If you pay $500, we'll take you there. You'll make in a week what you make in a month in Florida. In 2 years, you can come back and buy a nice house in San Marcos." Albert decided to take that risk. In September 1984, he paid the $500 he had saved at the factory. One night, he and 20 other men set sail, but something went wrong. "The Coast Guard caught us just a few hours after we set sail," he said. "They deported us all immediately, but the real trouble started after that. The smugglers blamed me. They blamed me for making noise and attracting attention. He asked me for another $500 to cover the cost of the operation," she said. "There was no way I could get that money. I had no money. When I told him I couldn't pay, he threatened me. He said if you don't pay in a week, very bad things will happen to you." According to Albert, this was the reason for his sudden disappearance from Jacksonville. "I had to leave Jacksonville that same night. Sarah, those guys weren't kidding. I'd heard of people being killed, beaten, just because they couldn't pay. I packed what few belongings I had and got on the first bus out of the bus station. So why didn't you write to me? I asked. Why didn't you come back to me? To San Marcos? Albert lowered his head and answered because I was so ashamed, Sarah. I was a complete failure. I had no money, no job. I was afraid those men would come after me. I was a coward who had failed my family, who had failed at everything, Albert told me. From September 1984 onwards, he moved around different cities in the South. He worked wherever he could find work, on farms, in construction, in markets, always temporary, low-paid jobs. I lived like a man with no past and no future, he said. I slept wherever I could. If I was lucky, I got 1 meal a day. I always hid because I was afraid the men in Jacksonville would find me. All these years, I thought about you and our son every day, he continued. But as time went on, it became harder and harder to go back. How was I going to explain that I had been alive all this time but didn't dare to go back? How could I justify years of absence? I thought it would be better for you to think I was dead, to rebuild your life, to be happy. Now think while listening to this. Is this befitting a father? No matter how ashamed he is, no matter how much he fails, a man who loves a child will find a way. An anonymous letter, a small coin sent through a friend. There are 1,000 ways to make your presence known, even without showing your face. But such absolute silence, it wasn't just shame, it was a terrible callousness. Albert told me that in 2000, exactly 17 years after he left us, he secretly came back to San Marcos. He wanted to see us from afar. I found out you had married an engineer, he said. You had a new life. Our son was in college. Seeing you happy made me think it was the right decision not to return at that moment. I thought you were better off without me. You were in San Marcos and you didn't approach us? I shouted. Albert, do you know how much pain you put me through? Do you know how much I suffered thinking you were dead? Do you know how hard it was to raise our son alone, trying to explain to him why his father was absent, enduring people's gossip? That's when I started crying, but not out of sadness. It was anger. I know, Albert said, his eyes full. I know. And that pain has gnawed at me for years. You had a stable life, a new family, a future. All I could offer you was more trouble and pain. Albert continued to live in cities in the South after he saw us from afar in 2000. Alone, working in temporary jobs. In 2010, he settled in Mobile, Alabama. For the first time in years, Albert said, I had a steady job and a place to stay, but I was still a lonely man. No family, no real friends. I just lived with the weight of what I had done. In 2020, when I was 63, I became diabetic. The doctors told me that I had to take care of myself. I had to take my medication regularly, not live alone, so that I could get help if something happened. That's when I thought, maybe it was time to turn back. I should ask for your forgiveness, make things right before I die. But I was so scared, Albert admitted. What if you no longer live here? What if you reject me? What if your new family doesn't want me? For 4 years I tried to work up the courage. Until 2 months ago, when the doctors told me I had a heart condition, I decided I had to try. Before I died, I wanted to ask your forgiveness, to tell you what happened, to make things right between us. When Albert finished his story, we were silent for a few minutes. I had so many conflicting emotions inside me that I didn't know what to say. Part of me understood what had happened a little better, but the other part of me was angry, because he had made the decisions about our lives all by himself. He had left us in pain for years, silent only because he knew we were okay. Albert, I finally said, I understand that you have problems. I also understand that you are afraid to go back. But we were your family. You should have fought for us. You should have trusted us. We're supposed to decide what to do together. You decided for us. You thought it was better not to exist in our lives, but it wasn't your right to make that decision. Albert nodded. I know, he said, and I'm not asking you for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth. I wanted to apologize to you before I die. And if he wants to see my son, I just want to talk to him. I want to tell him that his father didn't abandon him, that he was just a coward who didn't know how to do it right. That's when I realized Albert really believed that what he had done was the least bad option. In a difficult situation, he ran away, believing that he was doing the least harm. But at the same time, I also realized this. This man's return was not a gift for me, but a huge problem. Because now I had a life that I had built with his absence for 39 years. And now, this ghost from the past was trying to return to a place that no longer existed. Albert was sitting in my living room, waiting for my answer. I was trying to digest the most shocking moment of my life. Oh, my dear children, you must understand my state at that moment. The young Sarah in me wanted to run and hug, to cry, to forget everything. But the older Sarah's inner voice was screaming, "Be careful. If life has taught me anything, it's this. If a story sounds like a movie, it's probably not real. The truth is usually much less dramatic, but much more painful." And at that moment, I had to make the hardest decision of my 69 years of life. What was I going to do with this man? This man who had once been my husband, who had abandoned our son, who had kept silent for more than 39 years. Now he was back. He wanted forgiveness. He wanted to be part of a family that no longer existed. After listening to Albert's whole story, I told him that I needed time to digest what he had said. You can't just show up out of the blue after 39 years and expect us to make such an important decision in one afternoon, I said. This is a matter that affects not only me, but our son, our grandchildren, our whole family that we have built over the years without you. Albert nodded, that he understood. I'm in no hurry, Sarah. I've waited 39 years for this conversation. I'll wait longer, if I have to. I asked him where he was staying. He said he was renting a room in a hostel near the city center. I gave her my phone number so we could stay in touch while I made the decision. I tossed and turned in bed. I thought about what Albert had told me. I tried to understand how it felt to have him back. Part of me was relieved, because at least I knew he wasn't dead, that he had been alive all these years. But another part of me was angry, because he could always come back if he wanted to, but he chose not to. The next day, I called my son Daryl to tell him what had happened. You can imagine, he was shocked. Dad's alive? He said in disbelief. And he hasn't called us all these years? I told him the whole story, everything his father had told me. Daryl was silent for a long time. Mom, he finally said, I grew up without a father. Grandpa David was a father figure to me. Then Harvey became like a real father. This man may be my biological father, but he is not my father. My father was the one who was there when I was in school, who watched me graduate, who held my hand when I got married, who was there when my children were born. A father doesn't leave his family and come back 39 years later as if nothing happened. My son's words hurt me deeply, but they also clarified many things in my mind. Albert had lost the right to be the father in his son's life the day he decided not to return. He could no longer claim that place because that place had already been filled by someone else, and because it was impossible to get back the years that had passed. Daryl's words hit me like cold water, but they were necessary. A father's love could not be compensated by an apology 40 years later. And in that moment, the first spark of doubt lit in Sarah's heart. Where would this doubt lead him? We'll see together. For the next 2 weeks, Albert called me every day. He told me where he had worked all those years. He showed me old photographs he carried with him. He told me that he still loved me, that he had never lost that love, despite the years and the distance. It was clear he wanted to pick up where we left off, as if the 39 years were just a long parenthesis. But I was no longer a 24-year-old woman waiting for her husband. I was a 69-year-old woman who had lived a full life in his absence. I had raised our son on my own. I had completed my education. I had a career. I was happily married to Harvey. I had grandchildren. I had traveled. I had started my own business. I was a different person, and Albert did not know this new woman. She had never been part of this life. Moreover, there was something about Albert's story that didn't quite convince me. If he had really been in this country all these years, working in ordinary jobs, why hadn't he once tried to contact us indirectly? Why didn't he send an anonymous letter? Why didn't he send us money? Why didn't he inquire about us through an acquaintance? Fear and shame were insufficient to explain 40 years of absolute silence. One day, I decided to do something Albert would never have expected. I told him that I wanted to go with him to the county registry office. "If you really are Albert Derek Martin," I said, "that is my ex-husband who is legally presumed dead, then the authorities should verify your identity and cancel the death certificate." Albert suddenly became very nervous at this suggestion. "Why is that necessary?" he asked. "I know who I am and so do you. Isn't that enough?" This reaction aroused even greater suspicion in me, because a truly lost man should have looked forward to getting his legal identity back. And remember, the intuition of a woman who has lived almost 70 years is rarely wrong. Albert's nervous reaction was the first red alert that I could no longer ignore. And from that moment on, this story became no longer a search for feelings, but a search for truth. The seeds of doubt that had fallen inside Sarah were beginning to grow. Now she had to find out for sure who this man was. Despite her nervousness, I insisted on verifying his identity. In the end, Albert agreed to my suggestion. When we arrived at the offices, Mr. Peters, the officer assisting us, asked us to show our identity papers. Albert produced a very old and worn voter registration card and what he claimed was his birth certificate. The officer examined the documents for a long time, compared them with the records on his computer, and then asked us to wait a few minutes.
"This man is probably not who he claims to be your husband," the officer said. "Maybe someone who once knew your husband. He has learned some details of his life and is now trying to impersonate him for some unknown purpose." When I left the registry office, I was heartbroken. But this time it wasn't sadness, it was anger. Someone had played with my emotions. Someone had used my pain and my past for their own purposes. Anger had replaced the pain. Can you imagine the pain of losing a spouse, the weight of being abandoned, and now the anger of learning that all this pain was actually a fabricated deception? But what would angry Sarah do now? Let's find out together in the next chapter of this dramatic story. I returned home. I picked up the phone, and I called Albert. "We need to talk immediately," I said. "Come to my house right now," I said. An hour later, Albert appeared at my door. And this time, I was ready for the most important conversation of my life. What happened afterward showed me this. Even at 69, a woman can still be surprised by what she's capable of when she's betrayed. When Albert entered my home that afternoon, I had already planned everything. During that hour I waited for him, I had prepared everything I needed to expose this fraud, who had been playing with my emotions and my family's past. On the table in the living room, I had laid out all the original letters that the real Albert from Jacksonville had sent me. I had placed our wedding photos, snapshots from the early years of our marriage, and an official document I had obtained that morning from the county clerk's office. "Sit down, Albert," I said. My voice was calm, but my tone was filled with unwavering determination. "We have some very serious matters to discuss." Albert sat down on the same sofa he had sat on 2 weeks earlier, but this time he was much more tense. He rubbed his hands together constantly and was sweating, even though it wasn't hot. He avoided looking me directly in the eye. "Before we begin our conversation," I said, "I want you to see this." I handed him the document I had taken out. It was a copy of the real Albert Derek Martin's birth certificate, along with all the information officially verified by the authorities from the Georgia archives. "This," I explained, "is my husband's real birth certificate. As you can see, there are a few important differences between this and the documents you gave me." Albert's expression changed instantly. That look of tension turned to panic, then to resignation. He stared at the document in silence for several minutes. Then he lifted his head and looked at me with an expression I no longer recognized that look. "Who are you?" I asked, coldly, directly, bluntly, and in a cold tone. "What is your real name, and why are you here, pretending to be my dead husband?" The man who introduced himself as Albert stood up, walked to the window, then turned back to me. But this time, the expression on his face was completely different. Gone was the humble, remorseful husband. In its place was something else entirely, the stance of a man who knew a terrible lie had been exposed. Gravelly voice. "I am the real Albert Derek Martin, but I used the name Walter Sanders because those men are still after me." As soon as I heard that name, I knew where I remembered it from. It was the name written on a letter sent to me from Jacksonville in 1984. The signature, at the bottom of the fake letter, saying that Albert couldn't write because he had injured his hand. "Did you write that letter in 1984? I asked. "Did you send me that fake letter saying Albert was injured?" Albert bowed his head and said quietly, "Yes,
I wrote that letter and signed it with my friend's name, just to protect you. I never believed it. A voice inside me was telling me I was caught up in a big lie, and then he told me a completely different story. A story that explained what really happened, but one that was far more painful than I could have imagined. Albert said he met Walter in Jacksonville in 1984. They worked at the same factory and shared a room for several months. He would talk about San Marcos, his family, how much he missed them, and his longing to return. What happened to the real Walter? I asked. Albert looked at me with very sad eyes and said, "Sadly, Walter died in September 1984, Sarah. He died at sea, trying to cross into another country. The men came after me, so I used my dead friend's identity for years to cover my tracks and protect you." The truth had finally come out, far more painful, far more brutal than Sarah could have imagined. The man talking to me was not the real Albert, but Walter. But he was telling me a different story. Anyone in my place would have felt it was a big lie. In fact, her husband was not a traitor. He was a victim. But that bitter truth didn't excuse Walter's actions. Would Sarah accept this explanation? Or would she see his true intentions? Let's hear her decision. Sarah decided to do a thorough investigation. And as a result of her investigation, Albert had decided to cross the border with a smuggler, to make money faster and to get back to Sarah and her son as soon as possible. The night before he left, he gave Walter photos of Sarah and his son, and he said, solemnly, "Who are you?" I asked, coldly, directly, bluntly, and in a cold tone. "What is your real name, and why are you here, pretending to be my dead husband?" The man who introduced himself as Albert stood up, walked to the window, then turned back to me. But this time, the expression on his face was completely different. Gone was the humble, remorseful husband. In its place was something else entirely, the stance of a man who knew a terrible lie had been exposed. Gravelly voice. "I am the real Albert Derek Martin, but I used the name Walter Sanders because those men are still after me." As soon as I heard that name, I knew where I remembered it from. It was the name written on a letter sent to me from Jacksonville in 1984, the signature at the bottom of the fake letter saying that Albert couldn't write because he had injured his hand. "Did you write that letter in 1984? I asked. "Did you send me that fake letter saying Albert was injured?" Albert bowed his head and said quietly, "Yes, I wrote that letter and signed it with my friend's name, just to protect you." I never believed it. A voice inside me was telling me I was caught up in a big lie, and then he told me a completely different story. A story that explained what really happened, but one that was far more painful than I could have imagined. Albert said he met Walter in Jacksonville in 1984. They worked at the same factory and shared a room for several months. He would talk about San Marcos, his family, how much he missed them, and his longing to return. "What happened to the real Walter?" I asked. Albert looked at me with very sad eyes and said, "Sadly, Walter died in September 1984, Sarah. He died at sea, trying to cross into another country. The men came after me, so I used my dead friend's identity for years to cover my tracks and protect you." The truth had finally come out, far more painful, far more brutal than Sarah could have imagined. The man talking to me was not the real Albert, but Walter. But he was telling me a different story. Anyone in my place would have felt it was a big lie. In fact, her husband was not a traitor. He was a victim. But that bitter truth didn't excuse Walter's actions. Would Sarah accept this explanation? Or would she see his true intentions? Let's hear her decision. Sarah decided to do a thorough investigation. And as a result of her investigation, Albert had decided to cross the border with a smuggler, to make money faster and to get back to Sarah and her son as soon as possible. The night before he left, he gave Walter photos of Sarah and his son, and he said, solemnly, "But when Albert was killed at sea, Walter couldn't find the courage to write the truth. Instead, he wrote a letter to Sarah, a fake letter saying that Albert had injured his hand and couldn't write. At that moment, my dear friends, I felt something I had never felt in my 69 years of life. Anger, deep pain, but above all, unshakable determination. This man had come to my home. He had reopened wounds that had closed years ago and had spun a completely different lie about my husband's death. But I knew this wasn't over. I couldn't just send him away at the door. I couldn't act as if nothing had happened, because this man had played with the memory of my dead husband. He had distorted his death. He had manipulated my life, my feelings, and he had disrupted my family's peace. I couldn't sleep that night, but this time it wasn't because of sadness. There was a strange energy inside me. It was something I had never felt before in my life. It was as if, after 69 years of always reacting to other people's decisions, I was finally going to take control of something for the first time. The next morning, I began planning what to do with Walter Sanders, because now I wouldn't be the one adapting anymore. I would be the one writing the rules of the game. But this time, it would be different. This time, I would decide how to proceed. This moment marks Sarah Tampson's transformation. She is no longer a victim of fate. She is now the architect of the game, the hunter. It is truly awe-inspiring to watch a 68-year-old woman turn her pain into a flawless plan for revenge. So what was this plan? And would it work? Don't take your eyes off the story, because it's just beginning. The first thing I did was call my son Daryl and tell him everything I had learned. My son was furious. "Mom, that man is a fraud, a manipulator. We need to call the police right away," he said. But I told him to wait because I had a plan in mind that was far more effective than turning him into the police. I explained, if we turn him into the police, he'll be charged with fraud or identity theft at most. He'll serve a few years in prison, then he'll be released and continue his life where he left off. But I want more than that. I want him to truly understand the damage he has caused. When someone plays with your life and your feelings, I want him to experience firsthand how it feels. Over the next 3 days, I developed a very careful plan. First, I researched everything I could find about Walter Sanders. I went to the boarding house where he stayed and spoke with the owner, Mrs. Ruth. She was an elderly woman and had known our family for years. "Oh, Sarah," Mrs. Ruth said, "I'm glad you came to ask about that man. Ever since he first arrived, I've had a bad feeling about him. He's always making phone calls in a low voice. He seemed like he was hiding something all the time. He also keeps letters and some documents in a locked suitcase. Plus, last night, a young man came looking for him. They talked in the garden until very late." This information proved that Walter wasn't acting alone. He probably had partners. This was probably part of a larger fraud scheme, a system targeting widowed women and families who had lost a loved one. This gave me even more determination to carry out my plan. The second step was to seek help from people I trusted and who understood the seriousness of the situation. The next day, I met with my brother Scott, who works at the prosecutor's office, and told him everything that had happened to me in the finest detail. Scott told me that Walter's actions covered multiple crimes, fraud, identity theft, and even emotional blackmail. But, "Look, brother," Scott said, "for the charges to hold up, we need evidence that clearly shows his intent to defraud. He needs to confess what he did and why he did it, in his own words." This was exactly what I had planned. I also spoke with County Clerk Mr. Fremina Peters. He explained to me that such cases are actually much more common than people realize. Some organized groups research the backgrounds of families who have lost a loved one, send people to take the place of those losses, and commit other frauds through money extortion or personal information collection. Mr. Peters helped me obtain all the official documents related to Albert's death notice and explained in detail the legal process for how Walter's actions could be punished. But he also warned me, if Walter is truly part of a larger organization, simply arresting him will not completely resolve the issue. "Ms. Wright," thoughtful Peter said, "if we really want to take down these kinds of fraud rings, we need to learn how they work, who's involved, and what other families they target. And the only way to get that information is to make him think his plan is working." That gave me the perfect idea for the most important part of my plan. Instead of confronting Walter and turning him into the authorities right away, I would show him that I believed his lie. I would act like a woman who believed him, trusted him, and was even willing to help him get what he really wanted. And in this way, I would learn every detail that came out of his mouth, the other players in the scheme, and their true intentions. I would use all this information to hold both Walter and his accomplices fully accountable before the law. The third step was to create the perfect setting for the final confrontation. I decided the perfect place was my own home because it was under my control. I had all the evidence there, and I could set up an environment where I could record the events without Walter noticing. My grandson Alex works in computer systems. He helped me set up a top-secret audio and video recording system in the living room. We placed small hidden cameras behind the photo frames. We also placed small microphones under the coffee table. Grandma Alex said, "This is like a spy movie. Are you sure you want to do this?" "I'm sure, honey," I replied. "That man played with your grandmother's deepest feelings. Now he's going to find out that a 69-year-old woman is not such an easy target." My granddaughter looked at me with an admiration I'd never seen before. "Grandma, I have never seen you so determined. That man doesn't know who he is dealing with." I had also prepared all the documents I would need: copies of the fake letters Walter had sent in 1984, a copy of the presumed death certificate for Albert, some photos of my family. These were things Walter could use if he tried to ask for money or gather information, and a fake document I had prepared with Mr. Peters' help. This document contained information about the substantial inheritance I had received from my husband Harvey's life insurance. The fourth step was the most important psychological preparation. Throughout my life, I had always avoided conflict, strived to maintain peace, and preferred to suffer in silence rather than confront someone. But this situation required me to become a completely different person, calculating, determined, and intelligent enough to outmaneuver someone who was trying to manipulate me. I stood in front of the mirror and worked on different speaking styles, different facial expressions, and body postures. I had to convince Walter that I believed his lie, that I was emotionally weak and vulnerable, that I was an easy victim, just as he had hoped. At the same time, I had to mentally prepare myself for any reaction Walter might have when he realized that I had known the truth all along. If he tried to leave, if he became aggressive, if he tried to deceive me again with new lies, or if he simply broke down and confessed everything, I had to be prepared for each of these possibilities. The fifth step was to arrange for reliable people to witness what would happen. I decided to have my brother Scott and Mr. Peters hide in the kitchen. From there, they would be able to hear the entire conversation and intervene immediately if anything went wrong. I had also coordinated with my son Daryl. He would wait outside the house and call the police immediately if necessary. "Mom," Daryl said, "I still don't understand why we didn't just call the police directly and end this. Why are we making it so complicated?" I had to explain to him. I wanted to get all the information I could before Walter was arrested. "Son," I said, "if we arrest him now, he may deny everything. He may say that he truly believes he is your father. He may make up a new story that will lead to a reduced sentence. But if we can convince him to confess his true intentions, if we can get information about his accomplices, and if we can prove that this was a planned fraud, then we can ensure that he receives the harshest punishment he deserves." The sixth step was to reestablish contact with Walter for a final meeting. I sent him a message through Mrs. Ruth. In the message, I said I had thought long and hard about everything he had told me, that I had talked to my son, and that we wanted to meet with him again. I also said that we understood why he had done what he did, that we wanted to help him, and that maybe we could find a way to be a family again. When Mrs. Ruth described Walter's reaction to the message, I knew my plan was working. "Oh, Sarah," Mrs. Ruth said, "when I gave him your message, he was overjoyed. His face lit up. He said he knew you were good people and that you would understand him. He even asked me if your family was wealthy and if your son was successful in life. These questions confirm that Walter did not come to my house just to confess the truth about Albert's death. He had a specific purpose. Walter had come to our home with a specific purpose. He wanted something from us: money, personal information, or access to our family for a long-term scam. The seventh and final step was deciding exactly what to say to Walter when he came to my home. How would I convince him to confess his true intentions and explain to him that I had known everything from the start? I rehearsed the entire conversation with my brother Scott countless times. Scott played the role of Walter, and I prepared and reviewed every response. "Sarah," Scott said after one of our rehearsals, "I've never seen you like this before. You're like a professional actor or an experienced detective." I laughed and said, "Scott, this Sarah has always been here. She just didn't have a strong enough reason to defend herself and those she loves." The night before the final meeting, I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep.
I was excited. For the first time in my life, I would be the one completely in control of an important situation. The one holding the information, directing the conversation, deciding how it would end. I thought about all the times in my life when I was a victim of other men's decisions. When Albert suddenly left home one day without talking to me. When the real Albert decided to cross the border and never told me. And those years when Walter lied to me about his death. The same Walter who decided to come back into my life and play with my emotions. All those years I had to react, adapt, and survive. But this time, everything would be different. This time, I would be the one making the important decisions. I would decide what information to share and when. I would control the pace of the conversation. I would decide when the game would end and when all the cards would be revealed. The next morning, I got up early. I carefully put on a sea blue dress. It gave off an air of respectability, but fragility. I simply combed my hair and tied it back and prepared my home to host Walter one last time. I set up the recording devices, checked that the witnesses were ready, organized all the necessary documents, and sat down to wait. At exactly 3 o'clock, I heard the doorbell ring. I took a deep breath and said to myself, Sarah, it's time to teach someone what it costs a 69-year-old woman to mess with the wrong family. When I opened the door, Walter was waiting there with a huge smile and a bouquet of red carnations. He was wearing new clothes, gray cloth pants, a neatly ironed white shirt, and he'd even gotten his hair cut. The fact that he had spent money on his appearance for this meeting clearly showed that he was expecting something serious from it. He was definitely hoping to get something from us. Sarah, my love, he said in that tone of voice that I now knew was completely fake. You can't imagine how happy I was when I got your message. I knew you would understand me. I was sure we'd find a way to be together again. He handed me the carnations and tried to kiss my cheek, but I pulled away slightly. Come inside, Albert, I said, deliberately using his fake name. We have a lot to talk about. I led him into the living room, offered him coffee, and sat down in the same chair I had sat in 2 weeks earlier when he first told me that made-up story. But this time, everything was different. This time, I was in complete control of the situation. Albert, I said, as we sat down with our coffees, I've thought a lot about everything you told me. My son and I talked for hours, what your return means for our family, how we can move forward from here. Walter leaned forward, clearly eager to hear what I had to say. At first, I was very confused. I was very hurt, I continued. But then I realized, you're right. We really did live a good life without you. And we could only have done that if we hadn't known that you had died in such a terrible way. Believing that you decided to start a new life, even though it hurts, maybe it was better for us. Walter's face lit up suddenly. Oh, my love. I knew you'd understand. I knew you'd realize I did everything just to protect you. I only thought of you. He took my hand in his palms. And I had to make a great effort not to pull my hand away immediately. The dampness and coldness of his hands were very different from Albert's calloused, warm hands. But now that you're back, I said, we need to discuss some practical matters. It's been exactly 39 years, Albert. I've completely rebuilt my life. I have property, savings, a job. Now that you're back, how are we going to sort all this out? This was the question I had planned to ask him from the start. The perfect bait to lure him into revealing his own truth. What a clever move. Sarah isn't just setting a trap. She's playing a psychological chess game. Every word, every glance, every touch is meticulously planned to draw her prey step by step into the center of her web. Walter, unaware that he is walking toward an end meticulously prepared by his own victim, will he fall for it? Let's hold our breath and watch. The tension rises. Walter let go of my hand and leaned back in his chair with a more serious expression on his face. Well, my dear, he said, I was thinking the same thing. I don't have much. Just a small savings from the work I've done over the years.
But you, from what I can see, you've been very successful. Your son is an engineer. You own this beautiful house. I suppose you must have accumulated quite a fortune. Daryl is doing very well, I said. He and his wife live in a very nice neighborhood. The children go to a private school, and he has a good position at a large engineering firm. He's even planning to start his own company next year. All of this was true, but I had exaggerated a bit to gauge Walter's reaction. Thoughtful. Great. Really great, Walter said. But there was a calculation, a planning in his eyes. Clearly he was weighing something in his mind. Thoughtful. Well, would your son help his father get back on his feet in San Marcos? Because I'll need a job, a place to live, and new documents to resolve my legal situation. There it was, the first clear clue to his true intentions. Walter hadn't come here just to confess Albert's death or ask for forgiveness. It was clear he had come to seek financial support from us, to use our family feelings to get something out of us. Thoughtful. Of course, I said. Albert is still a bit confused, but we talked, and he decided he wants to meet you. He wants to help you get your life back in order here. Actually, he's coming here soon to meet you and talk. Walter's face lit up again. But before he comes, I continued, I want to ask you something very important. All these years, did you never think of writing us a letter or sending money, even anonymously, or asking someone about us? This was a critical question for my plan, because I wanted him to explain why he had remained silent for so long. Walter grew a little uneasy. Well, yes, my love. I thought about it many times, but sad. I was very afraid. I was afraid you wouldn't want me anymore, that you had built a new life, that you might have forgotten me. And also, he continued, if you knew I was alive, I was afraid you would come looking for me. That could have put all of us in danger. Feigned concern. What danger? I asked, with a feigned look of concern. Are there still people who could harm you? This question was perfect, because it gave Walter the opportunity to either invent a new lie, or, if he really did have dangerous associates, to expose them. No, he said immediately. There's no danger now. Those people are either dead, or they've long since forgotten me. That's why I was able to come back now, said Walter. Sad, but for many years I was very afraid that if they came looking for me, they might hurt you too. This was clearly a lie, but it was a lie that served my purpose. Albert, I said, taking his hands again, I need to ask you one more thing. How did you find me after all these years? How did you know I was still living in San Marcos, still using my married name, hadn't moved to another city? This question clearly unsettled him. He remained silent for a long time, and I could clearly see him trying to come up with another lie. Well, I asked around, he finally said. Eventually I reached San Marcos and asked about the Tamsin family in the San Marcos neighborhood. Someone told me he was living here after his second marriage. This was a very vague and unconvincing answer. If he had truly been missing for 39 years, he should have explained in much greater detail how he found me. This vagueness clearly indicated that he had already gathered information about me before coming here, likely conducting some preliminary research. Well, I asked directly, how did you find out about my second marriage? How did you know I married Harvey, that I was widowed, that I was living alone again? This time Walter visibly became uncomfortable. He started sweating, rubbing his hands nervously. Well, people said, he said, but his voice was shaky and uncertain. When I asked you, they said you were married to an engineer. But now they added that you are widowed. Like the previous one, this was also a very general, vague answer. For someone who didn't know me to have such specific information about my personal life, it couldn't be possible based solely on hearsay. At that moment, I decided to increase the pressure a little more. Albert, I said, I'm very happy you're back, but there's something I need to be sure of. I need to be sure that you're really my Albert, that I haven't made a mistake. I took out one of the wedding photos I had prepared and placed it in front of him. Can you tell me what happened on the day this photo was taken? What happened that day that only you and I know about? Walter stared at the photo for a long time. I could see his mind working furiously, trying to come up with details that would sound convincing. Well, it was a beautiful day, he finally said. We got married at St. Mark's Church. It was crowded. Your mother had prepared some wonderful food. These were the kind of generic details anyone looking at the photo could have made up. But what exactly happened during the ceremony? I pressed. What did you whisper in my ear while we were exchanging vows? What problem did we have with the ring? What happened while we were cutting the cake? Walter tensed up even more because he didn't know any specific details about that day. Oh, my dear, he said with a fake smile, years have passed. I can't remember all the little details, but I still remember how beautiful I found you, how happy I was to marry you. Years have passed. I can't remember all the little details, but I still remember how beautiful I found you, how happy I was to marry you. It was exactly the answer I expected, an ambiguous, emotional answer with no original details. Just then, the doorbell rang. "It must be my son," I said to Walter. "Are you ready to meet Daryl after all these years?" Walter nodded excitedly. He was eager for the chance to deceive my son as well. When I opened the door, the person standing there was indeed my son Daryl, but he wasn't alone. With him were Mr. Peters from the county records office and my brother Scott. "Hello, Mom," Daryl said with that familiar smile of his. That smile, it always appeared on his face before he surprised me with something big. "Albert," I said, making sure Walter could hear me from inside the living room. "How nice. I'm glad you're here. And look, what a big surprise. Daryl brought Mr. Peters with him. Didn't I tell you we'd be talking to your father today?" My son winked at me and said, "Yes, Mom. That's exactly why we brought the officer. We want to resolve all my father's legal issues as soon as possible." When we entered the living room, Walter immediately stood up and extended his hand to my son. "Daryl," he said, his voice tinged with artificial emotion. "My son, you have no idea how long I've been waiting for this moment. You have no idea how much I've thought about you over the years." My son shook his hand gently, but I could see in his eyes that he was struggling to suppress his disgust. "Nice to meet you, Dad," my son said. He pronounced the word dad in a strange, almost ironic tone. "My mother told me about your return. I can imagine how difficult it must have been for you to be away from us for so many years." Mr. Peters and my brother Scott sat down in the remaining chairs. Walter was a little nervous about having so many people around. It was written all over his face. "All right," said Mr. Peters in a formal tone. "Mrs. Wright has explained your legal situation to us. We understand that you have been absent for years and now need to rectify your status. We are here to assist you with all the official procedures." Walter smiled broadly. He was beginning to believe that his plan was working. "Thank you very much, sir," said Walter. "Yes, I have a lot to take care of. Documents, identification, everything needed for me to start a new life here with my family." Mr. Peters pulled out a full folder of documents and placed it on the table. "Perfect," said the officer. "To start the process, we need you to share some details about your life during this long absence. For example, where exactly did you live? What name did you use? What identification documents did you use?" Walter visibly grew uncomfortable at these specific questions. Mr. Peters took careful notes and then said, thoughtful, "Excellent. In that case, we should have no problem verifying your identity with the official records of those cities." At that moment, I decided it was time to end the game. Walter had given enough clues about his intentions. He had clearly shown that he didn't know the original details of Albert's life and had completely fallen into the trap we had set. "Albert," I said, using that fake name one last time, "before we get into all these legal formalities, there's something very important I need to tell you." I got up from my chair and walked over to the corner where I had prepared the documents. "There's something we learned when we went to the county records office last week, and you need to know about it." Walter's face changed instantly. Surprised. "What?" he said, his voice no longer sounding confident at all. Nervously, "What did you learn?" I smiled, firmly. "We found out exactly who you are, Walter Sanders. And we also found out exactly what happened to the real Albert Derek Martin in September 1984. The silence that followed my words felt like an absolute void. Walter stood there completely frozen, his mouth agape, as if he had seen a ghost. My son, Mr. Peters, and my brother Scott rose from their seats almost simultaneously. They were prepared for any reaction. "How?" Walter murmured. "How did you find out?" I approached him. I spoke in a calm but firm tone. "Walter, we've known the truth since the day you arrived here. Everything you've experienced in the last 2 hours, what you've heard, what you've seen, was exactly the same as what we experienced. A carefully planned lie, manipulation of emotions, a cruel game that plays with a family's hopes and past. This was the moment of justice. Every lie, every plan, every mask began to crumble in the face of the truth and the wisdom of a woman whose heart had been shattered. Walter had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated a grandmother. This was the climax of everything. But the story didn't end there. What happened after the fraudster was arrested? Let's listen now. How did Sarah truly find peace? "This isn't possible," he muttered, disbelieving. "You couldn't have known." Challenging. "What couldn't we have known?" I asked, rhetorically. "That Albert died in 1984? That you're Walter Sanders? Do you think we couldn't have known that you came to us with a fraud scheme?" I showed him all the documents I had prepared, the reports we obtained from the population registry, the identity verification documents, the results of our investigation into his past. "Second," I continued, "we investigated your real story, Walter. We know you didn't come from Mobile as you claim. We also know you have a criminal record for fraud in other states. We learned you've tried this method before, impersonating deceased relatives to deceive widows.
and extort money from them. Mr. Peters stood up and placed a rather thick file on the table. "Mr. Sanders," said Mr. Peters in a formal tone of voice, "we have here reports of at least 3 similar cases in the states of Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana. You and the people you work with have used exactly the same method to investigate families who lost a loved one years ago. You or those working with you have used the exact same method. Investigating families who lost a loved one years ago, then impersonating that person, gaining the family's trust, and then defrauding them of money or property." Walter's face paled further. No, he said in a voice so soft it was barely audible. "This is a misunderstanding. I really knew Albert. I really wanted to help." But I cut him off immediately. "Liar!" I shouted with a strength I didn't even know I had. "Everything you've said since day one is a lie. The real Albert, yes. He died in September 1984, just as you said. But you weren't his friend. You were part of the criminals who killed him." At this accusation, Walter jumped up from the chair. "That's not true," he shouted. "I didn't kill anyone. I really knew Albert. Yes, we worked together. He specifically asked me to write to you if anything happened to him." At that moment, it was the panic of a man trying to salvage at least part of his story. My brother Scott approached him, a serious look on his face. "Walter Sanders," he said, "I've been working in the district attorney's office for 20 years. I've seen many cases like this. We know exactly how these fraud rings operate. They research old obituaries, missing person records, and deaths where the body was never found. Then they impersonate these individuals to extort money, property, or personal information from their families. But this time, you made a huge mistake. You chose the wrong family. My sister Sarah isn't a lonely, vulnerable widow. She's a smart woman. She has a close-knit, strong, and well-connected family. And when you got involved with her, you got involved with all of us." Mr. Peters pulled another document from his folder. "Mr. Sanders," said Mr. Peters, "here's an arrest warrant issued by a judge in Atlanta. This warrant is related to your defrauding 72-year-old widow Eleanor Goodman of $400,000 by pretending to be her missing son in 2019. Mr. Goodman," he said in an even more emphatic tone, "died of a heart attack 2 weeks after learning he had been defrauded." Upon hearing these words, Walter completely collapsed. He slumped back in his chair and began crying like a small child. "I didn't want this to happen," she sobbed. "I didn't want anyone to die. I just needed money. I was sick. I didn't have a job." But I didn't feel even the slightest shred of compassion for her. Annoyed, "Walter," I said, approaching her and standing directly in front of her. Angry, "Do you realize the damage you've done to me? Do you know what it means to believe that I've been married for 39 years to a man who chose not to come back? Angry, do you know the pain it causes? A son to believe that his father didn't die but chose to abandon him? I didn't think," Walter tried to say, but I didn't let him finish. "You didn't think at all," I shouted. "You calculated. You planned. You came here deliberately, intentionally, to hurt us, to take our money. And do you know what the worst part is? You came here to defile the memory of a man who was murdered. You built lies on top of a man who couldn't defend himself." At that moment, my son Darrell came over to me, put his hand on my shoulder. "Mom," he said softly, "enough. We've taken everything we need." He was right. We had gotten Walter to clearly admit his intent to defraud. We documented his methods, proved he was part of a larger ring. Mr. Peters turned to Walter firmly. "In a few minutes, officers from the sheriff's department will arrive here to arrest you. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to consult with an attorney. And you have the right to make a phone call. But you also have the opportunity to cooperate with the authorities. If you cooperate fully, provide the names of your accomplices, explain how you gathered information about the families you targeted, and help us locate other victims. This could be considered a mitigating factor in court. But if you continue to lie, try to protect your accomplices, the punishment you receive will be much harsher." Walter raised his head and looked at me with pleading eyes. "Sarah," he said, "please, you're a good woman. You're religious. Have mercy on me. I'm sick. I'm old. I have no family. I have nothing. If I go to prison, I'll die there." Those words triggered an unknown anger inside me. "Mercy?" I asked, in shock and anger. "You want mercy from me? After all you've done? After defrauding a 72-year-old woman and driving her to her death from shock? After defiling the memory of my deceased husband? After playing with my family's emotions?" "Walter," I continued,
I am a Christian woman. You're right about that. But that's why I know very well that what you're doing isn't just stealing money. You're stealing hope. You're stealing peace. You're stealing the dignity of families who've already suffered enough. You're feeding off the pain of widows and orphans. And that deserves justice, not mercy. Just then, the doorbell rang. My brother Scott opened the door and returned with 2 sheriff's deputies. "Mr. Walter Sanders," said one of the officers, "you are under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and membership in a criminal organization. You have the right to remain silent." As the officers read Walter his rights and cuffed his hands, he continued to look at me with that pleading gaze. But I didn't break my composure. I wasn't going to show him the slightest bit of remorse or sorrow. He didn't deserve it. "Walter," I said as they led him away, "there's one more thing I want you to know. The 72-year-old Eleanor Goodman, whom you defrauded and who subsequently lost her life, had a grandson. That grandson is a lawyer, and for the past 5 years, he has been searching for you to make you pay for what you did to his grandmother. He will be one of the main witnesses in your trial. And there's more," I continued. "We will bring your case to the public. Your photo and the methods you used will be published in newspapers and on television so that other families can protect themselves from scammers like you. Your face will be recognized as that of a scammer who profits from the grief of families mourning across the country." When Walter was taken out of the house, there was a few minutes of deep silence in the house. My son, my brother, Mr. Peters, and I sat in the living room, trying to process what had happened. For the first time, 2 weeks later, I felt a real sense of peace inside me. "Mom," my son finally said, "I've never seen you like this before. I don't remember ever seeing you this strong." I smiled and said, "Son, I didn't know that side of myself either. But sometimes life takes you to a place where when you have to protect your family, you discover who you truly are." Mr. Peters explained that the legal process would take several months, but that the evidence we had was very strong, and a conviction was highly likely. He also mentioned that Walter might cooperate with authorities to reduce his sentence, which could help catch other people involved in his fraud network. "Mrs. Wright," Mr. Peters said before leaving, "what you did here was extraordinary. Your planning, your patience, your ability to manipulate someone who was trying to manipulate you. It was all flawless. I'm sure this case will help protect many other families." That night, after everyone had left and I was alone in the house, I sat down in the chair where Walter had sat that afternoon and told his lies. I thought about everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks, from the moment he first knocked on my door to the moment he was taken away in handcuffs. For the first time in my life, I had complete control over an important situation. I was the one with all the information. I was the one managing the timing, and I was the one deciding the outcome. And I had not only protected my family, I had achieved something that would protect other families in the future. I realized that since Albert left me in 1982, I had been living my life reacting to situations created by others. But this time was different. This time, a 68-year-old woman had taken control, made a strategic plan, and carried out a flawless act of justice. And for the first time in many years, I was proud of myself. I had transformed from an abandoned, grieving woman into a symbol of strength and justice. Sarah didn't just bring peace back to her family. She also protected countless people. Her story was a powerful testament to the saying, "It's never too late to stand up for what's right." And now, it's time to share the deepest lessons she learned on this journey. This is invaluable advice that we all need to hear. The week following Walter's arrest was quite intense. Local newspapers reported the story with headlines like, "68-year-old grandmother takes down fraud ring," and "Florida widow's perfect revenge." My photo appeared on the front page of the San Marcos Sunday newspaper. And even a TV reporter came to my home for an interview. At first, I didn't want to speak to the media. Albert's past, Walter's lies, and the fact that my private life was being exposed to everyone made me feel ashamed. But Mr. Peters convinced me, "Miss Wright," he said, "there are thousands of widows in America who could be targeted by con artists like Walter. Your story could protect them. Also, the more people this case reaches, the more victims will have the courage to come forward and file complaints." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecutor's office received more than 15 reports from similar fraud victims across the country in Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and even Texas. Other frauds using methods very similar to Walter's came to light. One of the most important calls came from Eleanor Goodman, who died after being defrauded by Walter in 2019. She wanted to come all the way from Atlanta to San Marcos to see me and thank me. "Ms. Wright," she said when we met, "the fact that this man will finally face consequences for what he did means more to me than I can describe. My grandmother was a good, hardworking woman. She was widowed at a young age and raised her children alone. The savings Walter stole from her were meant to cover my younger brother's university education. After she realized she had been defrauded," Ms. Goodman continued, "my grandmother fell into a deep depression. She stopped eating, stayed locked in her house, and stopped talking to the family. She lost about 20 pounds in 2 weeks and then had a heart attack," Ms. Goodman said. "The doctor said it was due to the emotional stress of what she had gone through." Hearing this story showed me once again how right my decision had been. Walter was not just an ordinary thief. He was a man who ruined lives. He was someone who destroyed hopes and dreams and who sought to bury the dignity of elderly people who already had painful pasts. The legal process took 6 months. During this time, Walter agreed to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. He confessed to his involvement in the entire operation. This operation was an 8-person fraud ring operating in the southeastern United States, led by a man nicknamed the Lawyer, based in Atlanta. The system worked as follows. First, obituaries and missing person reports in old newspapers were researched. Then, in the cities where potential victims were selected, someone was sent to learn more details about the families of these individuals. Was the family in good financial standing? Was the widow still alive? Did they have successful children? Were they living alone, or did they have relatives to protect them? After all this information was gathered, someone like Walter would be sent to impersonate the deceased person and gain the family's trust. The goal was not just to steal money directly. By gaining access to banks, properties, and personal information, they were laying the groundwork for future fraud. In some cases, they even altered the victims' wills to their advantage. According to Walter's confession, our family's case had particularly caught their attention. This was because their research had revealed that my son was a successful engineer. They knew that my home in a small business belonged to me, and that my late wife, who had recently passed away, had a good life insurance policy. "We thought you'd be an easy target," Walter had said in his statement, but they had made a huge mistake. They hadn't accounted for how tightly knit our family was, that we had connections in the government and the legal system, that my son was intelligent and skeptical, and most importantly, that despite being 68 years old, I still had the energy to fight to protect my family. Walter's trial took place in January 2025. I was the main witness. For 2 days, I had to recount the entire story in court, from the day Walter knocked on my door to the day he was arrested. It was the first time in my life that I had to testify in a courtroom, and at first, I was very nervous. But when I saw Walter in the defendant's chair, wearing a prison jumpsuit, handcuffed, and seated between 2 guards, I remembered all the pain he had caused me, all the lies he had told, and the anger inside me gave me the strength to speak clearly and confidently throughout the entire trial. When the judge granted me the right to make a victim impact statement, I said, angry, "Your Honor, this man is not just a thief. He is someone who feeds on the pain of people who have lost their families. He is someone who destroys the peace of widows and orphaned children. He is someone who kills the hopes of people who have already suffered enough." Thoughtful, I was lucky, I continued. I was able to expose his lies before he stole my money. But other families weren't so lucky. Annoyed, Mrs. Eleanor Goodman lost her life because of this man. How many more elderly women have suffered, or will suffer, if this man doesn't get the punishment he deserves? The judge sentenced Walter to a total of 12 years in prison for the following charges: aggravated fraud, identity theft, membership in a criminal organization. Additionally, he ordered him to pay Mrs. Eleanor Goodman's family $500,000 and my family $50,000 in moral damages. As the judge read the verdict, Walter began to cry.
and looked at me with those pleading eyes, just like the day he was arrested. But this time, there was no softening on my face. My expression remained calm and serious because I had learned unwarranted mercy is dangerous. Some people use the kindness of others to perpetuate their own wickedness. After the trial, the other members of the fraud ring that Walter was part of were arrested one by one. The person known as the lawyer turned out to be a disbarred accountant. This man was the ringleader of the fraud ring, targeting the elderly. They were all sentenced to prison terms, ranging from 8 to 15 years. The case gained so much attention that a national magazine called Extraordinary Women published an article about me. The title of the article was Sarah Wright, the grandmother who took revenge on a fraudster. The article detailed the entire process of how I planned and executed Walter's arrest. I couldn't help but laugh as I read it, because I, someone who had always been quiet, hardworking, and avoided trouble, was now being portrayed as cunning, calculating, and vengeful. It was as if I had discovered a completely new side of myself. My grandchildren loved the story. My grandson Alex, who helped me take the recordings, boasted at school, "Grandma caught a gang." My granddaughter Sophia, on the other hand, said she wanted to be a grandmother who doesn't let anyone walk all over her when she grows up. But for me, neither fame nor recognition was the most important thing. The most important thing for me was that I had secured justice for Albert, for myself, for my family, and for all the people who had fallen victim to swindlers like Walter. I had managed to turn my pain into action. I had turned my vulnerability into strength and my age into wisdom and strategy. And I had shown that a 69-year-old woman with life experience, a supportive family, and sufficient determination could be a very dangerous opponent for anyone who tried to harm her. In the months following the trial, I began receiving letters and phone calls from women all over the country. They all shared their own stories of fraud, abuse, and moments when they felt vulnerable and helpless. Many sought my advice on how to manage the issues they were facing. Others simply called to say, "Older women are not easy targets. You showed us that." One of the letters that affected me the most came from Monterey. The woman who sent it wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to question a man who claimed to be my lost brother. Thanks to you, I learned he was a con artist before he could take my money." And she concluded her letter, "Mrs. Wright, thanks to you, I realized this man was a con artist before he could steal my life savings. You taught me that grandmothers can be smart and strong when they need to be." These letters showed me that everything really mattered. I had not only protected my own family, I had helped protect many other families as well. My story was no longer just a memory. It had become a tool to educate others and defend them against criminals. It had become an example showing women that they did not have to remain silent in the face of these criminals who preyed on their pain. Now, 7 months after Walter's arrest, my life has returned to normal. I still run my food business. I still live in the same house. I still find joy in my grandchildren's laughter, but I am no longer the same Mary. Now I am a woman who knows that she can face any situation, no matter how difficult. I am a woman who sees that age and experience are great advantages when used correctly, and I have learned that sometimes the best defense is a well-planned attack. Sometimes justice requires a person to take action with their own hands, and, most importantly, I am now completely at peace with Albert's death. I now know exactly what happened to my first husband. I know that he lost his life while trying to return to me and our son. I know that he did not leave us willingly. This certainty has allowed me to completely close that chapter of my life and focus solely on the present and the future, leaving the past behind. Dear friends, I have now told you the entire story from the beginning. From the day I met Albert to the day I brought the man who defiled his memory to justice. And now I want to share with you the most important lessons I have learned in my 69 years of life. The first lesson is this: it is never too late to defend yourself. For years I believed that being a, quote, good woman meant putting up with everything, forgiving everything, and avoiding every conflict. But what happened to me with Walter taught me that sometimes being good
means being strong. It means protecting your family. It means making criminals pay for what they've done. I was 68 years old when Walter knocked on my door. Most people would think that a woman of that age couldn't do much against a professional con artist. But my age gave me exactly the tools I needed. The experience to recognize when something was wrong. The patience to plan carefully. Not just patience, but also the wisdom to know that I had people I could ask for help, and that I didn't have to face this man alone. The second lesson is this: criminals who target the elderly greatly underestimate their victims. Walter had assumed I was a lonely, defenseless widow. He thought he could easily manipulate me with lies about my deceased husband, but he hadn't accounted for the fact that in my 40 years as a widow, I had learned to be a strong, independent woman. He didn't realize how strong my ties to my family were, how I could use the resources and connections around me, or how developed my intuition had become. People like Walter think that old people are weak, but they confuse weakness with age, kindness with naivety, and loneliness with helplessness. But we older women have survived many storms in life. We have learned to solve difficult problems, and our instincts, that inner voice that tells us something is wrong, are stronger today than ever before. Third lesson: a family united is the greatest obstacle to any kind of abuse or fraud. If I had truly been alone, if I hadn't had my son Darryl, my brother Scott, my grandchildren, and my acquaintances at the government office by my side, Walter would likely have succeeded in his plan. But because we trusted each other as a family, we worked together and managed to expose him. Today, many elderly women feel alone and vulnerable. But the truth is, many of us have far more support than we realize. Our children, grandchildren, siblings, neighbors, even childhood friends, if we ask for help, are ready to lend a hand. The problem is that we sometimes feel ashamed to admit we need help. We hesitate to speak up about the difficult times we're going through. But in reality, asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom. Lesson 4. Planning and patience are immense powers that should not be underestimated. When I realized Walter was a liar, my first reaction was to kick him out of my house, yell at him, and call the police immediately. But instead, I chose to stop and think. I made a plan. I carefully designed my steps. And thanks to that, I obtained evidence about his intentions, learned about his accomplices, and experienced the satisfaction of trapping him in his own trap. If I had acted out of anger that day, Walter would probably have denied everything, made up excuses, and perhaps disappeared without facing any consequences. The fifth and final lesson: seeking justice is not about revenge. Justice is about responsibility. My goal in catching Walter was not revenge. It was to protect my family and other families. Revenge is personal and destructive. Justice is communal and protect. Revenge seeks to inflict pain. Justice seeks to prevent further pain. When I set a trap for Walter, it was not because I hated him specifically, but because I saw the danger he represented. Because someone like Walter, who was released every day, could defraud another family every day, could ruin another life. The sixth lesson is this: the wisdom and power of older women are not sufficiently recognized and valued by society. Throughout my life, people have always defined me in relation to someone else. First as Albert's wife, then as Darryl's mother, then as Harvey's wife, and finally as my grandchildren's grandmother. I have always existed in someone else's shadow. But when I had to confront Walter, I discovered my own identity. I was Sarah Thampson, a woman who stood on her own 2 feet, with her own intelligence, her own talents, her own strength, and as a woman who proves. A 69-year-old woman is nature itself. But this power does not belong to me alone. This power exists within each of you, a power waiting to be awakened. Because never forget, age brings wisdom, experience brings strength, and a woman who has weathered the storms of life, when she decides to fight for what is right, becomes an unshakable force. May God be with you and give you strength. Thank you for listening to my story. If this message resonated with you, let's build a community of strong women together. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write where you watched it in the comments. We'll see you again in the next story.